You find yourself standing in the shadow of an ancient, towering cathedral. It is the cold morning of the year 1236. The air of England is damp, and the sky still seems asleep behind a veil of pale blue mist. Somewhere in the distance, faint bells echo, as if time itself has paused to take a breath. Through the stained glass windows, the first rays of sunlight enter, spilling fragments of rainbow across the stone floor. Light, smoke, and silence blend together to create a scene that is both beautiful and unsettling. The air is heavy with the scent of incense. In the half-darkness, between the soft rustle of silk gowns and the murmured whispers of nobles, the sound of muted prayers reverberates through the cathedral like an ancient spell. Today should have been the happiest day in a young girl's life. Yet, if you look closely, the air carries not joy, but trembling fear. Before the altar stands a bride, her hands shaking, not with happiness, but with pure terror. This is Eleanor of Provence, only 13 years old. Beside her stands King Henry III of England, 28 years old, and a complete stranger to her. She has never spoken to him before, never even seen his face. And now, as the king lifts her veil, she looks at him for the very first time. A moment that marks the end of her childhood. In that instant, she knows that within a few hours she will face something far more dreadful than any battlefield, plague or execution, her wedding night. This isn't the tale of a dreamy wedding, nor a poetic love story. It is the grim reality of medieval royal marriages. A time when 13-year-old girls were traded by their fathers for power and alliances, when the most private moments of a woman's life became public spectacle, and when wedding nights were not symbols of love, but rituals of fear, pain, and submission. Welcome to the dark truth of history. A world where medieval queens feared their wedding nights more than death itself. These aren't just stories of nervous brides. They are chronicles of an organized cruelty, of innocent girls used as pawns in political bargains, girls who had no right to choose and no protection of their innocence, girls who knew their wedding night might be the last night they would ever feel safe. And before we descend into these haunting stories, if you wish to uncover the hidden truths of history, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. It's astonishing to think that across centuries, languages and lands, we are rediscovering these forgotten tales together. Defying time and distance, bound by our shared curiosity about the past. Remember this, medieval royal marriages were never about love. They weren't the union of two hearts, but the alliance of two kingdoms. The first truth you need to understand about medieval royal marriages is that they had absolutely nothing to do with love. These were not unions between two hearts. They were contracts between two kingdoms. They were business deals where honor, land, and power held value, and the bride's emotions were not only considered meaningless, but often seen as dangerous, because if a woman began to feel, she might begin to resist, and that resistance could shatter the delicate balance of power between dynasties. Now picture this. You are the daughter of a noble house, barely 10 or 11 years old. You're playing with your dolls or stitching small flowers into a piece of cloth when your father's servant arrives and says, "His lordship wishes to see you." You walk into his chamber, curious and innocent. He looks at you, neither smiling nor showing affection. And then, with a calm finality, he says the words that change your life forever. Your marriage has been arranged. No one asks your opinion. No one seeks your consent. It's simply a decree, a decision already made. You are to marry a man you've never met, in a land you've only heard about. You're too young to understand what it means. But at that very moment, your childhood ends. From now on, you are just a pawn in the chessboard of power. Margaret Bowett's story was no different. At the age of 6, she was betrothed to John Deol, the son of the Duke of Suffolk. But 3 years later, when she turned 9, political winds shifted, and she was promised again, this time to Edmund Tudor. Her will was never asked, her heart never heard. In those days, a girl's worth wasn't measured by her intelligence or gentleness, but by the land she brought, the alliances her marriage secured, and above all, the children she could produce. The psychological burden of such a life was unimaginable. These girls grew up knowing that their bodies were not their own, that their futures were written by men sitting in distant castles, and they lived in constant fear, never knowing when the summons would come, or which stranger they'd be forced to marry. But sadly, this was only the beginning of the cruelty. The true horror began with a ritual known as the bedding ceremony, a tradition so humiliating, brutal, and invasive that by modern standards, it would be called torture. This was not a private moment between two newlyweds. It was a spectacle, not an act of love, but one of public entertainment. When the wedding feast ended, the bride and groom were escorted to their chamber in the presence of dozens of guests. Family, friends, nobles, even complete strangers crowded inside. They laughed, shouted crude jokes, and pressured the terrified couple to undress in front of everyone. Laughter filled the hall, clothes were tossed about, and people made vulgar remarks about the bride's body. A moment that should have been sacred and private was turned into a shameful public spectacle. For royal couples, the humiliation ran even deeper. Their marriages were contracts of power, their consummation tied to the fate of entire kingdoms. So witnesses were required to ensure the union was truly completed. Sometimes these witnesses stood behind curtains or near the bed, just to confirm that the act had indeed taken place. The most painful part of this ritual was the moment when every trace of privacy was stripped away. The couple stood under immense pressure and fear, while the laughter and crude remarks of the onlookers echoed through the air. Each laugh, each sound, deepened the humiliation of that moment. For the bride, it was not a physical experience, but a spiritual imprisonment, where even her breathing, her silence, and her fear became part of the public spectacle. The bride's innocence, her pain, her fear, her tears, all of it became a spectacle before the onlookers. Imagine, a girl of just 13 years old, already trembling at the thought of the stranger she was forced to marry, and now, surrounded by dozens of adult faces as she is being undressed, she knows that the next moment will be the most terrifying experience of her life. This ritual was not just physical. It was a wound carved onto the soul, a trauma whose very thought makes the spirit shudder. But in that era, even this torment was a custom, a necessary ritual to validate the correctness of a royal marriage. The presence of witnesses was not considered cruelty, although its effect was utterly cruel. Virgin brides were considered a political treasure, and the confirmation of their loss of purity was mandatory, so that the legitimacy of the inheritance or offspring would never be questioned. If a queen failed to produce an heir, or if the child's parentage was doubted, these very witnesses would stand and say, "We saw, the marriage was consummated." A woman's suffering, her fear, her helplessness was simply considered collateral damage in a system where political gain was more sacred than human dignity. But perhaps the most horrifying aspect was not the humiliation or the intimate proximity to a stranger, but the age of the brides. These were not adult women. These were the innocent children who were thrown into these circumstances at the age of 8 or 9 years, situations they could neither understand nor endure. The youngest queen in English history was Isabella de Valois, who married King Richard II at the age of just 8 years. Imagine, today, if an 8-year-old girl were told to marry an adult man and share his bed, the very idea seems a crime against humanity. But for the royal families of the Middle Ages, this was standard practice. Eleanor of Provence was only 13 years old when she married Henry III. Margaret of Anjou was 15 years old when she became the Queen of Henry VI. Anne of Bohemia was also 15 years old when she married Richard II. These were not exceptions. This was the rule. The political value of these young girls was so high that their parents could not wait for them to mature, mentally or physically. And if all of this already seems horrifying, know that in that era, girls typically reach puberty at the age of 16, not at 12 or 13, as is common in the modern age. This signifies that numerous of these children brides were getting married and anticipated to generate descendants prior to their physical forms were even able to conceive. However, that didn't prevent their husbands from attempting, frequently resulting in catastrophic outcomes. The situation involving Margaret Bowett exemplifies the utter terror that faced these young sovereigns. At the age of 12, she was wed to Edmund Tudor, a man 24 years her elder. The tradition was meant that child brides would remain until physical development prior to consummation their unions. Edmund, however, was unable to hold on. He sought entry to Margaret's inheritance, and he required a successor to ensure his entitlement to her territory. What transpired afterwards can solely be characterized as organized sexual assault. Edmund Tudor, an adult man, persistently attacked his 12-year-old spouse until she turned expecting. Margaret's later writings in Life uncover the distress of this experience, depicting restless nights, perpetual terror, and the powerless anger of a kid caught in a grown-up's terror. It seems that your request is incomplete. Please provide the full text you want paraphrased. Edmund passed away from the plague. Under a year later, subsequently, he departed, leaving a 13-year-old behind, a pregnant widow carrying his child. Margaret was still a young girl when she entered labor, and the delivery almost ended her life. Her spiritual advisor afterward referred to it as a miracle that such a small individual might be able to give birth. The trauma from that birth was incredibly intense, that in spite of 2 subsequent marriages, Margaret did not have any more children. Her body had suffered irreversible harm from a pregnancy it wasn't prepared to manage. Margaret's encounter wasn't uncommon. Sure, please provide the text you would like me to paraphrase. Was the expected outcome of a system that regarded young girls as childbearers. These young queens confronted their nuptial evenings understanding the possibility of being assaulted, that they could be compelled to give birth before their bodies were prepared, and that they could perish during the process. Their fears were not unreasonable apprehension. Sure, please provide the text you would like me to paraphrase, were practical evaluations of the hazards they encountered. However, the trauma was just one aspect of the terror. The emotional effects of these organized unions formed a lineage of sovereigns who resided in perpetual dread, not ever awareness of when their spouses may change aggressive, always lacking anyone they could rely on or seek assistance from. They were cut off in unfamiliar courts, encompassed by outsiders who perceived them as political resources instead of human existences. The system was created to dismantle these girls, to change them from self-sufficient children into obedient spouses, who could bear offspring without inquiry or grievance. The first night of marriage was only the start of an existence marked by continual subjugation that would remove their sense of self, their independence, and frequently their desire to exist. As we explore more thoroughly these overlooked narratives, we'll uncover that the anxieties of medieval queens involved more than just a night of fear. They were nearly comprehending that their nuptial evening signaled the start of a life in which they would no longer possess control over themselves, their decisions, or their own fate. The genuine nightmare wasn't merely what transpired in the bedroom, it was what followed. When the morning arrived following that initial traumatic evening, these young monarchs uncovered that their ordeal was still not finished. The night of the wedding wasn't a solitary event of violence, yet the initial performance of a lasting saga, where each morning provided fresh causes to dread what existed forward reflect on the daily habits of a morning-year-old monarch who had recently faced an initial sexual encounter in a public spectacular. She would rise feeling achy, hemorrhaging, and mentally broken, merely to be assessed by court doctors, who required confirmation that she was no longer a virgin. Her bed linens would be examined for blood. Her physique would be pushed and poked by unknown people, and the deepest aspects of her trauma would be documented in official records for future generations. However, this tangible assessment was merely the start of a monitoring system that would observe every facet of her reproductive existence. Medieval queens were more than mere spouses. Sure, please provide the text you'd like me to paraphrase, were gestating bodies whose main worth lay in their capacity to generate male successors. Each month, court officials would monitor their monthly cycles. Each meal would be observed for indications of pregnancy. Every instance of privacy would be compromised by attendants tasked with providing updates on the reproductive capabilities of the queen. The urgency to become pregnant right away was smashing. A monarch who didn't succeed in becoming conceiving during the initial year of marriage encountered discreet allegations of barrenness, celestial retribution, or something even graver, unfaithfulness. The political coalitions that existed explained. Her distressing wedding night relied on her skill to obtain. The inheritance and defeat signified not merely individual shame yet, possibility nullification, banishment or demise. Margaret, of who wed Henry VI at the age of 15, suffered through 8 years of marriage before ultimately bringing forth an heir. 8 years of recurring letdown, of tribunal, doctors assessing her physical condition, of murmured conjecture regarding if she was hexed or flawed, when she ultimately gave birth to Edward of Westminster, The sense of relief was overwhelming, that she allegedly cried for hours, not from pleasure, but from the intense understanding that she had ultimately accomplished the goal for which she has been sold. The healthcare conditions of the middle ages pregnancy intensified these anxieties even further. Logical. Without contemporary healthcare awareness or health standards, giving birth was fundamentally a dying experience, a sentence that certain women endure. The death rate for females in the experience of childbirth was overwhelming and noble. Doctors were frequently more focused, prioritizing the baby over the mother. The queen's existence was significant solely to the extent as she was capable of bearing offspring. After she satisfied that role, her existence was less important than the child's. Hélène from Provence, who had quaked at her wedding altar, delivered her first offspring at 16. The labor continued for 3 days, and she almost passed away due to loss of blood. However, in a few months, she was expecting again due to the political demand for generating numerous heirs surpassed any worry for her bodily recuperation. She could ultimately have 5 offspring, each create a possible death penalty that she encountered the calm acceptance of a person who realized that her existence wasseldom truly hers. The mental cost of this reproductive bondage cannot be exaggerated. These young queens existed in perpetual anxiety about pregnancy, realizing that every conception could be their final. They created intricate superstitions concerning fertility, imploring saints for safeguarding, bearing talismans to avert miscarriage, and yielding to strange medical therapies that frequently accomplished more harm than benefit. Several queens attempted to seize power over their lives dedicated to reproduction through basic methods of contraception or pregnancy avoidance. However, these efforts were deemed as acts of treason. A monarch who proactively avoided conception was essentially betraying one's country by the monarchy and the political partnerships that relied on her ability to conceive. The consequences for these behaviors varied, from confinement to capital punishment based on regarding the political situation and the monarch's disposition. However, maybe the most devastating facet of their circumstances was the total seclusion they encountered. These young queens were generally dispatched to international courts, where they were unfamiliar communicated in various languages, and possessed without friends or defenders. They were separated from their families, their friends from childhood, as well as anyone who could have provided emotional assistance throughout their distressing shift-toted existence. The barrier of language alone added more layers of fear. Picture yourself at 13 years of age, already scarred by your wedding night, and only to find out that you are unable to interact with those nearby, unable to voice your fears, seek assistance, or even grasp what is required of you. The attendants communicate in an unfamiliar language, the customs are foreign, and the individual who currently dictates your existence is fundamentally our outsider who could very well be from a different planet. Isabella de Valois, the young queen of 8 years, was sent from France to the UK without any of her friends from childhood. She remained encircled by English nobles, who regarded her as a political oddity instead of a scared child. When she attempted to uphold French traditions or communicate in her mother tongue, she was reprimanded and compelled to adjust to English methods. Her sense of self, her heritage, her every aspect of identity was methodically removed and substituted with anything the English court considered suitable for their monarch. The surviving correspondence from these queens of the medieval era uncovers the depths of their anguish. They dreaded their wedding nights due to the fact that they instinctively grasped that all that defined their humanity, all that turned them into individuals, would be routinely dismantled in support of political alliances they were not involved in producing. These neglected queens confronted their marriage evenings with bravery of troops heading into combat, aware that they may not endure the ordeal, understanding that even if they managed to survive, they would no longer be the same individual who had traversed that path. Their anxieties were not the anxious enthusiasm of contemporary brides, yet the logical fear of children who realized that they were on the verge of being offered up on the shrine of politics' essentiality. The next occasion you spot a medieval nuptials depicted in films or TV, recall Eleanor of Provence shaking at her shrine. Recall Margaret Beaufort's distressing experience during childbirth. Recall Isabella de Valois weeping for her mother, speaking in a language unfamiliar to those nearby, was able to comprehend. Keep in mind that beneath each crown was an anxious child who'd been traded into a system that prioritized her solely for what her physique might create. These queens are worthy of being recalled not only as political leaders or historical annotations, yet as human individuals who faced unspeakable suffering with a power that ought to motivate use every single one. Their anxieties on the night of the wedding were fully warranted, and their bravery in confronting those fears teaches us that even within the bleakest pages of humanity, throughout history, the human spirit discovers methods to persist.